Sometimes the most profound transformations arrive not with fanfare, but with the whisper of wind through broken shutters and the desperate knock of a stranger at your door. For those who choose to live beyond civilization's reach, where the nearest neighbor might be 50 miles away and the closest town a memory on the horizon, every sound in the night carries weight. Every footstep could mean salvation or danger. Every decision could be your last. What happens when a man who has spent years perfecting the art of solitude suddenly finds that everything he thought he knew about survival, about trust, about the very essence of what it means to be human, crumbles in a single night? What happens when the walls you've built to keep the world out become the very barriers that trap you within your own fears? This is the story of Marcus Sullivan, a man who fled to the Montana wilderness not to find himself, but to lose everything he once was. It's the story of how one storm-ravaged evening shattered 23 months of carefully constructed isolation and forced him to confront a truth he'd been running from since the day he loaded his truck and disappeared from the life everyone expected him to live. Some say the frontier changes a man. Others believe it merely reveals who he truly is beneath all the pretense and social conditioning. But what no one tells you is that sometimes, just when you think you've found your answer in the silence of endless forests and star-filled skies, life sends you exactly what you didn't know you were looking for. The wilderness keeps its own schedule, follows its own rules, and teaches its own lessons. And sometimes, those lessons arrive in the form of a woman running through a blizzard with secrets darker than the mountain night, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a story that will either save two lost souls or destroy them both. Marcus Sullivan had been counting days for 23 months, but not the way most people count them. He didn't mark calendars or celebrate weekends. Instead, he counted them like a prisoner might count scratches on a cell wall, each sunrise representing another successful day of avoiding the world he'd left behind in Denver. The cabin he'd built with his own hands stood 47 miles from the nearest paved road, nestled in a valley so remote that even the most adventurous hikers never stumbled upon it. He'd chosen this spot carefully, studying topographical maps for months before making his decision. The location offered everything a man seeking complete isolation could want: fresh water from a natural spring, dense forest for hunting and firewood, and, most importantly, no neighbors for as far as the eye could see. Every morning, Marcus followed the same routine he'd established during his first week here. He woke before dawn, checked the weather through his single window, and stepped outside to breathe the mountain air that still felt foreign to his city-trained lungs. Then came the practical matters, checking his solar panels, monitoring his water supply, and assessing his food stores. Living off the grid required constant vigilance, but he'd learned to appreciate the simplicity of these concerns. Here, his biggest worry was whether he had enough firewood to last through the next storm, not whether he could face another day in his corner office watching his marriage crumble and his father's expectations crush his spirit. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. During his first month in the wilderness, Marcus had struggled with everything from starting fires to identifying edible plants. His hands, once soft from years of desk work, had become rough and calloused from handling axes and building tools. His body, accustomed to climate-controlled environments and catered lunches, had slowly adapted to the physical demands of frontier life. He'd lost 30 pounds that first year, not from any intentional diet, but from the simple reality that survival required constant physical effort. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the mental ones. The man who had once checked his phone every few minutes now went weeks without any electronic communication. The person who had lived by schedules and deadlines now measured time by the position of the sun and the changing seasons. Most significantly, the individual who had once defined himself by his relationships, his career, and his social status now existed in a world where none of those things mattered. Marcus had learned to hunt not from any romantic notion about living off the land, but from the practical necessity of supplementing his stored food supplies. His first successful deer kill had left him shaking and nauseous, but it had also provided protein for 3 months. He'd taught himself to preserve meat, to identify medicinal plants, and to read weather patterns in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. These skills had nothing to do with his former life as a financial advisor, but they kept him alive in ways his college education never could. The silence had been the hardest part to adjust to. In Denver, he'd lived surrounded by the constant hum of traffic, air conditioners, and human activity. Even in his sleep, the city had provided a soundtrack of distant sirens and late-night conversations drifting through thin apartment walls. Here, the quiet was so complete it had initially felt oppressive. He could hear his own heartbeat, his breathing, the rustle of his clothes as he moved. Every footstep on the wooden floor of his cabin seemed amplified. Gradually, though, he'd begun to distinguish the subtle sounds that filled the wilderness. The different calls of various birds, each indicating something about the time of day or approaching weather. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, following patterns he'd learned to recognize. The whisper of wind through different types of trees, creating a complex symphony he'd never noticed during his previous life of constant noise pollution. Winter had tested him in ways he'd never anticipated. The isolation that felt liberating during warm summer evenings became suffocating during weeks of blizzards and sub-zero temperatures. He'd made mistakes those first few months, underestimating how much firewood he'd need or failing to properly winterize his cabin. One particularly brutal storm had knocked out his solar power system for 6 days, forcing him to rely on candles and his emergency generator. During those long, dark nights, he'd questioned his decision to abandon everything he'd known. The worst moments came not during crises, but during the quiet times when his mind had nothing to occupy it but memories. He'd think about his ex-wife Sarah and wonder if she'd kept the house they'd bought together. He'd remember his father's disappointed face when he'd announced his intention to leave the family business. Most painfully, he'd recall the friends who had stopped calling after he'd made it clear he wasn't interested in maintaining his old social connections. But, with each challenge overcome, Marcus had felt something he'd never experienced in his previous life: genuine self-reliance. When his water pump failed in the middle of winter, he'd figured out how to repair it using spare parts and ingenuity. When a bear had broken into his food storage, he'd designed and built a better security system. When loneliness threatened to overwhelm him, he'd found ways to occupy his mind through reading, whittling, and maintaining detailed journals about his experiences. The journals had started as a practical necessity, a way to track his supplies and document lessons learned. But they'd evolved into something more personal, becoming the closest thing he had to conversation with another human being. He wrote about his daily challenges, his observations about wildlife, his thoughts about the life he'd left behind. Sometimes he wrote letters he'd never send, imaginary conversations with people he'd never see again. Marcus had also discovered talents he'd never known he possessed. Working with his hands came more naturally than he'd expected, and he'd gradually improved his cabin with handmade furniture, better insulation, and clever storage solutions. He'd learned to carve useful items from wood and had even tried his hand at basic blacksmithing using a forge he'd built behind his cabin. These activities filled the long winter evenings and gave him a sense of accomplishment he'd never felt in his corporate job. The changing seasons had become his calendar, each transition marking another successful period of survival. He'd witnessed the forest's transformation through spring flowering, summer abundance, autumn colors, and winter dormancy. He'd learned to anticipate these changes and prepare accordingly, developing an intuitive understanding of natural cycles that his urban upbringing had never provided. Physical fitness had come naturally through necessity rather than gym memberships. Chopping wood, hauling water, hunting, and maintaining his property provided better exercise than any fitness program he'd ever followed. His endurance had improved dramatically, and he could now hike for hours carrying heavy packs without the exhaustion that had once overwhelmed him during weekend camping trips. The mental clarity had been unexpected. Without the constant barrage of emails, meetings, social obligations, and media consumption, his thoughts had become more focused and deliberate. He found himself thinking more deeply about fundamental questions that had been buried under the busyness of his former life. What did he actually want from existence? What values truly mattered to him? What kind of person was he when stripped of all external expectations and social roles? These philosophical reflections had led to a kind of peace he'd never experienced. Not happiness exactly, but a deep contentment with his chosen path. He'd stopped missing the conveniences of modern life and had begun to see them as unnecessary complications. The simplicity of his daily routine felt like freedom rather than limitation. His relationship with nature had evolved from appreciation to something approaching reverence. He'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather, animal behavior, and seasonal transitions. He could predict storms by the way certain birds behaved, identify the best fishing spots by studying water currents, and find his way through the forest using landmarks invisible to untrained eyes. The solitude had also taught him things about himself he'd never recognized. He'd discovered that he was naturally more patient and observant than he'd ever realized. The quick temper that had caused problems in his marriage had disappeared entirely, replaced by a calm acceptance of life's challenges. He'd learned to solve problems systematically rather than reacting emotionally, a skill that served him well when facing the constant challenges of frontier living. As his second winter in the wilderness drew to a close, Marcus had begun to feel like he'd found his true calling. The man who had once dreaded Monday mornings now looked forward to each new day's challenges and discoveries. He'd created a life that felt authentic and meaningful, even if it was completely different from anything he'd previously imagined for himself. The transformation had been so complete that he sometimes wondered if he'd ever be able to return to civilization, even if he wanted to. The skills that made him successful in the wilderness would be useless in an office environment. The patience and self-reliance he'd developed might actually be disadvantages in a world that valued networking and quick decision-making over careful observation and methodical problem-solving. But these concerns felt abstract and distant during the warm days of late spring. Marcus had survived his second winter and felt confident about his ability to continue this lifestyle indefinitely. He'd stockpiled supplies, improved his living situation, and developed routines that made solitary life not just bearable but genuinely satisfying. He had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that his carefully constructed isolation was about to be shattered by events completely beyond his control. The storm that would arrive in just 3 weeks would bring more than rain and wind. It would bring another human being into his carefully ordered world, someone whose presence would force him to confront questions he'd thought he'd already answered about what it meant to be truly alone and whether the isolation he'd chosen was sustainable in the long term. The frontier had indeed changed Marcus Sullivan, just as he'd hoped it would. But his transformation was far from complete, and the most challenging tests of his new identity lay just ahead in the form of a woman running through the darkness with secrets that would either destroy his carefully built sanctuary or teach him that survival might mean something entirely different than he'd ever imagined. The storm arrived without the usual warnings Marcus had learned to recognize. Throughout his time in the wilderness, he'd become skilled at reading the subtle signs that preceded severe weather, the behavior of animals, the color and movement of clouds, the feel of pressure changes in the air. But this tempest seemed to materialize from nowhere, transforming a calm evening into a raging nightmare of wind and rain within the span of an hour. Marcus had been working on repairs to his roof when the first drops began to fall. The previous week's hailstorm had damaged several shingles, and he'd spent the afternoon carefully replacing them with materials he'd salvaged from an abandoned homestead 20 miles away. The work was delicate, requiring him to balance precariously while hammering in new supports, but he'd developed confidence in his ability to handle such repairs over the past 2 years. The initial rainfall felt refreshing after a particularly hot day. Marcus had stripped off his shirt while working, and the cool water on his skin was welcome. But, within minutes, the gentle drops transformed into a torrential downpour that made continuing his work impossible. He scrambled down from the roof, gathering his tools as quickly as possible while the sky continued to darken with unnatural speed. Inside his cabin, Marcus watched through his single window as the storm intensified beyond anything he'd experienced during his time here. The wind howled with a ferocity that made his sturdy walls creak and groan. Rain hammered against the glass with such force that he worried it might shatter. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark, terrifying snapshots, revealing trees bending at impossible angles under the assault of the wind. His preparations for severe weather had always been thorough, but this storm tested every system he'd put in place. The solar panels he'd mounted on his roof began making alarming noises as the wind tried to tear them loose. His generator, stored in a supposedly weatherproof shed, was struggling against moisture that seemed to penetrate every seal and barrier he'd constructed. Most concerning, the creek that provided his water supply was rising rapidly, threatening to overflow its banks and flood the lower portion of his property. As the hours passed, Marcus realized this wasn't just a severe thunderstorm but something approaching hurricane intensity, despite being hundreds of miles from any ocean. Weather patterns had become increasingly unpredictable in recent years, and he'd heard reports of unusual storm systems affecting mountainous regions across the country. But, hearing about such events and experiencing one personally were entirely different matters. The power from his solar system failed around midnight, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the intermittent illumination from lightning strikes. Marcus lit several candles and checked his emergency supplies, extra batteries, medical kit, non-perishable food, and backup communication equipment he rarely used. His satellite phone, which he kept for absolute emergencies, showed no signal in the current conditions. The sound outside was unlike anything in his experience. Beyond the constant roar of wind and rain, he could hear trees falling in the forest around his cabin. Each crash sent vibrations through the ground that he could feel through his feet, and he found himself mentally cataloging which directions the sounds were coming from, trying to assess whether any of the falling timber posed a direct threat to his shelter. Around 2 a.m, just as Marcus was beginning to think the worst might be passing, he heard something that made his blood freeze, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Through all the chaos of wind and rain, through the groaning of wood and the crash of falling branches, came the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on his door. The knocking was desperate and rhythmic, clearly human, but Marcus's first instinct was disbelief. No one knew about his cabin's location. The nearest hiking trail was over 15 miles away, and even experienced wilderness travelers would never venture out in conditions like these. His mind raced through possibilities. Perhaps someone had become lost and somehow stumbled upon his property, or maybe emergency personnel were conducting some kind of rescue operation he wasn't aware of. Marcus approached the door cautiously, his hunting rifle in his hands. Living alone for nearly 2 years had taught him to be suspicious of unexpected visitors, even under normal circumstances. In the middle of a dangerous storm, a stranger at his door could represent any number of threats. He'd heard stories of desperate people doing desperate things, and his isolated location made him particularly vulnerable to anyone with criminal intentions. The pounding continued, growing more frantic. Over the noise of the storm, he could hear a voice calling out, though he couldn't make out the words. The voice was high-pitched, possibly female, and filled with what sounded like terror. Marcus hesitated, his hand on the door's deadbolt. Everything in his experience of frontier living told him to be careful, to verify the identity and intentions of any unexpected visitor before allowing them access to his home. But the voice outside was becoming increasingly desperate, and his conscience began to override his caution. Even if this person represented some kind of threat, leaving anyone out in these conditions could be a death sentence. The temperature had dropped significantly since the storm began, and the combination of wind and rain created a situation where exposure could quickly become fatal. Marcus made his decision. He unlocked the door but kept the chain engaged, opening it just wide enough to peer outside. What he saw in the brief illumination of a lightning strike changed everything he thought he knew about his isolated existence. A woman stood on his porch, soaked to the skin and shivering violently. Her long dark hair was plastered to her head, and her clothes, which appeared to be ordinary streetwear rather than hiking gear, clung to her body. She was young, probably in her late 20s, and her eyes held a look of pure terror that went beyond mere concern about the storm. Marcus could see immediately that she was in serious physical distress. Her lips were blue with cold, and she was having difficulty standing upright. Whatever had brought her to his door in the middle of this nightmare, she was in immediate danger of hypothermia or worse. He quickly removed the chain and opened the door wide. The woman practically fell into his cabin, bringing with her a rush of cold air and rain. Marcus quickly shut the door behind her and turned to assess her condition by candlelight. She was conscious but barely coherent, mumbling words he couldn't understand while her whole body shook uncontrollably. Her feet were bare and bleeding, suggesting she'd traveled some distance over rough terrain without proper footwear. Marcus's first priority was preventing hypothermia. He'd read enough survival manuals to know that her wet clothes needed to be removed immediately, but the situation presented obvious complications. This was a complete stranger, and, despite her apparent distress, he couldn't be certain of her story or her intentions. Still, medical necessity outweighed social considerations, and he quickly gathered dry blankets and clothes while tactfully suggesting she change out of her wet garments. While the woman changed behind a curtain he'd strung across part of the cabin, Marcus prepared hot tea and soup, trying to get warming fluids ready as quickly as possible. His medical knowledge was limited to basic first aid, but he understood that raising her core body temperature was critical. He also tried to process the implications of her presence and what it might mean for his carefully ordered existence. The woman's condition gradually improved as she warmed up, but her mental state remained concerning. She seemed alert but frightened, constantly glancing toward the door and windows as if expecting someone or something to appear. When Marcus asked her name and how she'd found his cabin, her answers were evasive and inconsistent. She called herself Elena but couldn't or wouldn't explain how she'd ended up at his door in the middle of nowhere during the worst storm he'd ever witnessed. As the night wore on and Elena's physical condition stabilized, Marcus began to notice details that deepened his concern about the situation. Her hands showed signs of recent injury, with cuts and bruises that looked like defensive wounds. Her fear seemed focused not just on the storm outside but on something more specific and personal. Most troubling, she kept asking about whether his cabin could be seen from the main road, whether he had communication equipment, and whether anyone else knew about his location. Elena's story, as much as she was willing to share, was fragmentary and disturbing. She claimed to have been camping with friends when the storm hit, but she couldn't explain how she'd become separated from them or why she wasn't carrying any gear. Her clothes, while wet and dirty, didn't show the kind of wear expected from someone who'd been hiking in wilderness conditions. Most significantly, she seemed to have no knowledge of basic outdoor survival, asking questions about things any experienced camper would know. Marcus found himself in a situation he'd never anticipated during all his preparations for frontier living. His carefully constructed isolation had been breached not just by another human being, but by someone who appeared to be fleeing from some kind of danger. The skills he developed for surviving alone in the wilderness hadn't prepared him for the complexities of human relationships, especially when those relationships began under such mysterious and potentially threatening circumstances. The storm continued to rage outside, making any immediate resolution impossible. Even if Marcus had wanted to help Elena leave or contact authorities about her situation, the weather conditions made travel or communication impossible. They were effectively trapped together in his small cabin, two strangers with no choice but to coexist until the tempest passed. As dawn approached and the worst of the wind began to subside, Marcus realized that his life had been irrevocably changed. The sanctuary he'd built for himself was no longer a place of solitude and self-reliance. Elena's presence had introduced variables he couldn't control and questions he couldn't answer. Her fear suggested that whatever had driven her to his door might follow, potentially bringing the very kind of human complications he'd come to the wilderness to escape. The woman sleeping fitfully on his couch represented everything uncertain about human nature that Marcus had tried to leave behind. She could be a victim fleeing genuine danger, or she could be someone whose own actions had created the crisis she seemed to be running from. She might be grateful for his help and leave peacefully once the storm passed, or her presence might mark the beginning of complications that would destroy the peace he'd worked so hard to achieve. Marcus sat by his window as the first light of morning began to penetrate the storm clouds, watching Elena sleep and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The man who had spent nearly 2 years perfecting the art of living alone now faced the possibility that his isolation was permanently over. The storm outside was beginning to pass, but the tempest Elena had brought into his life was just beginning. Everything he'd learned about survival in the wilderness had prepared him for challenges involving weather, wildlife, and resource management. But nothing had prepared him for the complexity of human need, human fear, and human secrets. As Elena stirred in her sleep, murmuring words in what sounded like a foreign language, Marcus wondered if his greatest test wasn't surviving the elements but navigating the dangerous territory of trusting another human being again. Morning brought an eerie calm that felt more unsettling than the storm itself. Marcus had barely slept, spending most of the night watching Elena and trying to make sense of her presence in his carefully ordered world. The silence after hours of howling wind felt oppressive, broken only by the steady drip of water from his roof and the occasional creak of settling timber. Elena woke gradually, her eyes opening to survey the unfamiliar surroundings with the cautious awareness of someone accustomed to danger. Marcus pretended to be occupied with preparing breakfast, but he observed her careful examination of his cabin, noting the exits, assessing potential weapons, studying his movements with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned not to trust easily. In daylight, her injuries were more apparent and more concerning. The cuts on her hands and arms weren't consistent with someone who had simply gotten lost in the woods. They looked deliberate, defensive, the kind of wounds someone might receive while fighting off an attacker. Her feet, which had been bleeding when she arrived, showed signs of having run long distances over rough terrain without shoes. Most telling, she moved with the careful, guarded posture of someone expecting violence. Marcus offered her food and clean clothes, maintaining the polite distance of a reluctant host while trying to gather information about her situation. Elena accepted his offerings gratefully but remained evasive about her circumstances. Her story had shifted overnight from camping accident to car trouble, and now included references to hiking companions who had supposedly continued on without her when the weather turned dangerous. The inconsistencies in her account troubled Marcus, but so did the genuine fear he could see in her eyes. Whatever had brought her to his door, her terror was real and immediate. She jumped at unexpected sounds, positioned herself where she could see both the door and windows, and asked repeated questions about whether his cabin was visible from aerial view. These weren't the concerns of someone who had simply gotten lost during a camping trip. As the day progressed, Marcus ventured outside to assess the storm's damage to his property. The devastation was extensive. Several large trees had fallen across his access road, his solar panel array was partially destroyed, and his water collection system had been damaged by wind-blown debris. The repairs would take weeks, assuming he could obtain the necessary materials. More immediately concerning, the fallen trees had completely blocked the only vehicle route to his cabin, effectively trapping both him and Elena until he could clear the road. While Marcus worked on the most urgent repairs, Elena remained inside the cabin, but he could feel her watching him through the windows. Her vigilance seemed focused not on his activities but on scanning the forest for signs of approaching threats. This behavior reinforced his growing suspicion that her arrival hadn't been accidental and that whatever she was running from might still be pursuing her. The isolation that had once felt like freedom now felt like vulnerability. Marcus realized that his remote location, which had protected him from unwanted contact with civilization, also made it impossible to seek help if Elena's presence brought the kind of trouble he was beginning to suspect she carried with her. His satellite phone remained non-functional due to storm damage, and even if he could make contact with authorities, they were days away from his location under the best of circumstances. Elena's behavior throughout the second day reinforced Marcus's concerns while also revealing glimpses of the person she might be under different circumstances. When she thought he wasn't watching, he caught her examining his books, running her fingers over the titles with the hunger of someone who hadn't had access to reading material for a long time. She handled his possessions with careful respect, always returning things exactly as she'd found them. Most intriguingly, she seemed genuinely interested in his survival setup, asking thoughtful questions about his water purification system and food preservation techniques. During the evening meal, Elena's guard dropped slightly, and Marcus began to see past her fear to the intelligent, resourceful woman underneath. She revealed knowledge about subjects ranging from botany to engineering that didn't match her story about being a casual camper. Her hands, despite their recent injuries, showed the calluses of someone accustomed to physical work. Most significantly, she spoke with the slight accent of someone who hadn't learned English as a first language, though she tried to suppress it. The breakthrough came during their third evening together, when Elena finally began to share fragments of her real story. She was, she admitted, not American by birth. She'd come to the United States several years earlier under circumstances she still wouldn't fully explain, but it became clear that her legal status was complicated at best. The people she was running from weren't random criminals but individuals connected to whatever situation had originally brought her to America. Marcus listened without judgment as Elena revealed pieces of a story involving human trafficking, debt bondage, and the kind of organized exploitation that most Americans preferred to believe didn't exist in their country. She'd managed to escape from a situation that had held her captive for over 2 years, but her freedom had come at a price. The people she'd fled weren't the type to simply write off their losses, and they had resources for tracking down escapees that extended far beyond what local law enforcement could handle. The storm that had brought Elena to Marcus's door hadn't been coincidental. She'd been running through the forest for 3 days, staying off roads and avoiding any signs of human habitation, when the weather had forced her to seek shelter. His cabin had been the first sign of sanctuary she'd encountered, and her desperate pounding on his door had been driven by hypothermia as much as by the fear of her pursuers catching up with her. Marcus found himself facing a moral complexity he'd never anticipated. Elena's story, assuming it was true, made her a victim deserving of help and protection. But helping her also meant potentially bringing violence and danger into his carefully constructed sanctuary. The men pursuing her wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who had aided their escaped property, and Marcus's isolation made him particularly vulnerable to retaliation. The practical challenges were equally daunting. Elena had no identification, no money, and no legal status that would allow her to seek conventional help from authorities. Even if Marcus could somehow get her to safety, she would remain vulnerable to recapture unless her traffickers were permanently eliminated or imprisoned. Given the international scope of such organizations, neither outcome seemed likely through normal legal channels. Marcus's own situation was complicated by his deliberate disconnection from conventional society. He had no current address, no recent tax records, and no regular contact with anyone who could verify his identity or character. If Elena's pursuers did track her to his cabin, he would have little recourse to legal protection and no support network to call upon for assistance. Despite these concerns, Marcus found himself increasingly committed to helping Elena find genuine safety. Her courage in escaping her captors, her resourcefulness in surviving alone in the wilderness, and her obvious intelligence and fundamental decency had earned his respect and sympathy. More than that, her presence had forced him to confront questions about his own isolation that he'd been avoiding since coming to the mountains. The conversations that developed between them during long evenings revealed that both had been running from different forms of bondage. Elena had been literally enslaved, but Marcus had also been trapped by expectations, relationships, and a lifestyle that had felt increasingly meaningless and constraining. They had each found different forms of freedom in their escape, but both had also discovered the limitations and costs of complete isolation from human connection. Elena's practical skills impressed Marcus more each day. Despite her traumatic recent experiences, she proved remarkably adaptable to frontier living. She learned quickly from his demonstrations of basic survival techniques, contributed genuinely useful suggestions for improving his setup, and showed no squeamishness about the physical demands of life without modern conveniences. More importantly, she brought perspectives and knowledge that complemented his own abilities in unexpected ways. The possibility of a permanent arrangement began to seem less frightening and more appealing as the days passed. Marcus realized that his 2 years of solitude had been valuable for developing self-reliance and clarifying his values, but they had also created a kind of emotional numbness that Elena's presence was helping him recognize and address. He'd become so focused on avoiding the complications of human relationships that he'd forgotten their potential benefits. Elena, meanwhile, was experiencing her first taste of genuine safety and freedom since arriving in America. Marcus's respectful treatment of her as an equal, his willingness to listen without judgment, and his competent handling of the practical challenges of their situation offered her a glimpse of what normal human relationships might feel like. She began to relax her constant vigilance and to participate more actively in planning improvements to their shared living situation. The physical attraction that developed between them was unexpected but undeniable. Both had been alone for extended periods, and the intimacy of sharing confined space during dangerous circumstances naturally led to emotional and physical closeness. However, both were also wary of complicating their situation with romantic involvement, given the uncertainty of Elena's legal status and the ongoing threat from her former captors. The resolution came unexpectedly, through a combination of Elena's knowledge of her traffickers' operations and Marcus's skills in wilderness survival and tactical planning. Elena revealed that her captors relied heavily on technology and urban support networks that were useless in the remote mountains. Their tracking methods, while sophisticated in populated areas, were ineffective in genuine wilderness where there were no electronic signals to monitor or informants to cultivate. Marcus proposed a solution that would address both their needs for safety and freedom. They would establish a new life together in an even more remote location, using Elena's knowledge of her enemy's capabilities to stay permanently beyond their reach. His skills in frontier living, combined with her urban survival instincts and international perspectives, would create a partnership more capable than either could achieve alone. The plan required careful preparation and significant risk, but both had already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice everything for genuine freedom. Together, they began preparing for a journey deeper into the wilderness, to a location so remote and carefully chosen that no conventional tracking method could locate them. As they worked together on preparations for their shared future, Marcus realized that his 2 years of solitude hadn't been wasted. Instead, they had been preparation for this moment when he would need the skills and self-knowledge necessary to build something meaningful with another person. Elena had brought more than danger to his door that stormy night. She had brought the possibility of a connection that enhanced rather than diminished their individual strengths. The frontier had indeed changed Marcus, but not in the way he'd originally expected. He'd learned that true strength sometimes came not from standing alone against the world, but from choosing the right person to stand with. Elena's arrival had tested everything he thought he knew about survival, about trust, and about what it meant to be truly free. Together, they prepared to discover what lay beyond the frontier they had each been exploring alone.